Hi everyone, I'm Rachel. In this tutorial, I'll teach you how to color a serene seascape using the Color Therapy app. The key to coloring cliffs, sand, and ocean is working in several layers of different tools. I'll show you which ones work well together. If you want to follow along, find this image by searching for ocean in the search box. Alright, let's start off by tapping to fill in all of the colors first for the foundation. So I'm using the summer palette and set it to gradient, and I'm using the second color from the right on the second row, and I'm setting the gradient so that the turquoise part is going to be at the bottom. So just tap to fill in the water. I'm going to tap to fill in the boat too, just because I'm going to not include it right now. And then for the sky, I'm using the frozen palette, the second color from the right on the top row, and just setting the gradient so it's darker blue at the top and tapping it in. And then under the dreamy horizon palette, I'm using the fourth color from the right on the top row. I'm just setting the gradient so that it's going to be lighter on the right side and just tapping to fill in the cliffs. And since I'm going to be erasing the boat for this, just sample the colors around that area and just fill them in. And then under the floral palette, I'm using the second color on the last row. This time it sets as solid and just tapping to fill that in to the plants. All right, let's start off with the AIRBRUSH tool. Let's set the size to 20 and opacity at 100. And lastly, for the beach, I'm using the beach palette, just the last color on the bottom row and just tapping to fill it in. And I'm just setting that gradient so that it's darker towards the water. And then just sampling the lightest part of that sand and just using the AIRBRUSH tool to blend in anything, as well as just removing those fish. And with the AIRBRUSH tool, set the size at 20 and opacity at 100. Okay, so under the beach palette again, I'm using the fifth color on the top row. It's a nice light blue color. And with coloring inside the lines mode set to off, I'm just coloring it a bit light at the shoreline. So just adding in that light blue. And I'm just going to lower the opacity down to like 42% and just adding it in a little further out, kind of doing little back and forth strokes. Now select the third color from the right on the top row. It's like a dark turquoise color. This time, let's set the AIRBRUSH tool at size 15 and opacity at 40. And I'm just going to be shading the horizon line now, so you can turn coloring inside the lines mode to on or off as needed. If you're not coloring the boat, then it should be off. I'm also just going to outline the edge of all of the cliffs, so it's a little bit of a shadow coming down. You can also just tap in and draw little strokes of darker areas in the water, just here and there towards the back of the water. I'm also going to use that darkest color, so just to the left of that color, and just do the same thing for the very edge of those cliffs and along the horizon as well. So let's start to add in some texture. So let's use the splatter tool. Set the opacity at 2%, and now your size can be between 1 and 20. So I'm just going to start at size 10. And I'm using a light brown from the beach palette. You can use a variety of those different browns from that palette. And with coloring inside the lines mode set to on, I'm just adding in a little bit of sprinkles of splatters, just for some texture. And with coloring inside the lines mode set to on, I'm also just going to apply a few little dots here and there into the cliffs and the rocks. So I'm just using the same light colors from the beach palette. You can use a lighter yellow or a lighter orange, even a gray. Just kind of mix it up and just blend them into the rocks. Over in the brown 2 palette, I'm using the 5th and the 6th color from the top row. And now I'll be using another layer using the smudge tool. I'm setting the size at 50 and opacity at 40. I'm just starting with coloring inside the lines mode set to on. I'm just starting to add in some shadows into those cliffs. I'm just focusing on the left side of all the cliff faces. Just loosely drawing it in. Then you can use the darker brown too, the 6th color, and just add in a few darker areas of shadows. Then also you want to just shade with that darkest brown, the very bottom and edges of all the rocks where they meet the water. Now let's use the AIRBRUSH tool. Let's set the size at 50 and opacity at 20. Using that dark blue that we had before for the water, let's just add in a little bit of blue into the rocks. And this is just going to be reflective color. It also just tones down that brown a little bit. Let's work on the water. So let's set the AIRBRUSH tool to size 1 and opacity at 30. And I'm still going to be using that dark turquoise from before, and I'm just drawing little lines into the water. And you can follow the lines that are already there with coloring inside the lines mode set to off. I'm also going to do the same thing using white. Let's blend that now with the smear tool. Let's set the intensity at 100 and the size at 25. So now I'm just going to be blending the water gently, just blending in those lines. You can also apply this to the rocks here and there. Just add a few little bits of smudgy areas. Now with the airbrush tool, let's set the size at 1 and now raise the opacity to 70. And using white, let's now just draw in some little waves. So what we're doing is I'm just sort of tracing that bottom edge of the shoreline with kind of loose strokes. And I'm just turning coloring inside the lines mode 2 off. And some of the areas are a little bit thicker than others. You can also draw a few little waves in the water near the shore. Now with the splatter tool, set the opacity at 100 and the size at 7. And using white, I'm just adding it into the shoreline, little dots here and there. And just maybe a few into the waves that we drew too. Okay, let's add some more texture to the rocks with the glitter tool now. Size can be at 100, opacity at 2. Now using that darkest brown we had from the brown 2 palette, set coloring inside the lines mode 2 on and just add it into the rocks. Now we have lots of texture. You can dot it in or swipe it in. And now using the hair tool, let's set the size at 100 and opacity at 1. Using that same dark color, we're just gonna add even more into the rocks. You can kind of do like back and forth strokes. And you can also use the lighter brown too that we had from the beach palette. Use some of that on the edges. And then finally, I'll use the soft pastel tool, size 100, opacity at 80. Use those lighter colors from the beach palette and just tap it in here and there into the rocks. You can also use this in the sand, just turn off coloring inside the lines mode. And lastly, for the greenery, I'm using the flat brush tool, the size at 30 and opacity at 50. From that green palette, I'm just using a combination of different greens and leaving coloring inside the lines mode set to off. I'm just kind of scribbling in some greenery into it. And then I'll use the splatter tool on top of it with the size at 7 and opacity at 100. And I'll use some lighter green. And then with the splatter tool, I'll do size at 7 and opacity 100. And with some of the lighter and darker greens, I'll just spray it into the bush. If you'd like to see more tutorials like this, don't forget to subscribe to the Color Therapy YouTube channel so you don't miss any new tutorial videos. Thanks for watching our tutorial. You can get the Color Therapy app for free on the App Store.